After a long and tortured history, trial is finally set to begin against established Hollywood actor Alec Baldwin, facing manslaughter charges for the 2021 on-set shooting of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. Prosecutors allege that the Rust movie set was a disordered disaster waiting to happen, and that Baldwin was a centerpiece of that chaos, while the defense contends that Baldwin never pulled the trigger and the shooting, while a terrible tragedy, was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. On this special episode of Courtroom Confidential, here are 5 things you need to know. When news of this case first broke, it was described, and I think accurately so, as a tragic accident. And that's the way that people first reacted to it. The media first reacted to it. Anybody who heard about it, people in the legal community. But then the questions began to come as to, how could this happen? How could this happen? Oh my God, that's awful. Someone was killed on set. But wait a minute, how could that happen? The questions of, well, was there live ammunition on set? Why was a gun being pointed at anyone at all? Who was holding that gun? It was Alec Baldwin? Did he pull the trigger? And as these questions began to develop and flood the internet, and answers, some satisfactory, some not, came out, we now find ourselves on the eve of trial set to begin here in July of 2024. And so it's important, I think, to talk a little bit about that trial before things kick off. So let's begin. Number 1, what happened? So we're talking about October 21st, 2021 on the Bonanza Creek Ranch in Bonanza City, New Mexico. This was the 12th day of shooting for the Rust movie. The official synopsis on IMDb for Rust describes a 13-year-old boy left to fend for himself and his younger brother following their parents' deaths in 1880s Kansas, goes on the run with his long-estranged grandfather after he's sentenced to hang for the accidental killing of a local rancher. It was written and directed by Joel Souza, and it was a low-budget American Western film starring Alec Baldwin as the grandfather character. Baldwin was also a producer and co-writer. On the day of the shooting, according to prosecutors, firearms and ammunition were retrieved from a safe, and the armorer at the time, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, prepared 3 guns and placed them in a filming cart. Then, according to prosecutors, she handed them over to First Assistant Director David Halls. Halls then handed the gun to Baldwin while proclaiming the gun to be a cold gun. According to Halls, he did not, however, check the cylinder or the chambers to see if any of the rounds were in fact live rounds. A cold gun is a reference to a gun that has been rendered safe, and it's short speak for anyone on set to realize that that gun should not present a danger. In this apparent scene, Baldwin was going to be removing the gun from a holster and pointing it directly at the camera. And in fact, there is footage of him practicing this exact maneuver.
She's standing next to the camera. She's like this, you're me. She's got a monitor here. The camera is here filming that way. She takes a monitor that is his monitor, the operator, and turns it toward her. It swivels, and she says to me, hold the gun lower. Go to your right. Okay, right there. All right, do that. Now show it a little bit lower. And she's getting me to position the gun. Everything is in her direction. She's guiding me through how she wants me to hold the gun for this angle. And I draw the gun out, and I find a mark. I draw the gun out.
The crew members behind the camera included Halyna Hutchins, who was within 2 feet of where the muzzle was going to be. No one on set was wearing any kind of protective gear. Again, according to reports, Baldwin then says, so I guess I'm gonna take this out, pull it, and go bang. During this rehearsal, the gun discharged a single time. The bullet struck Hutchins in the chest, traveled through her body, and hit Souza in the shoulder. Hutchins was then airlifted to the University of New Mexico Hospital, where she later tragically died from her injuries. Let's talk a little bit about who Halyna Hutchins was. Fellow filmmakers described her as what sounds like a very joyful person. She was a skilled cinematographer who was deeply committed to her work. She grew up on a Soviet base in the Arctic Circle. Later on, she went on to study in the Ukraine, and she worked on documentary films in Eastern Europe. And eventually that would lead her to the States, where she would attend the American Film Institute Conservatory in Los Angeles. Number 2, a chaotic set. Investigators spoke to several witnesses who described the set as being disordered, chaotic, bordering on dangerous. It was a low-budget film, as we discussed. Apparently, there were 2 accidental gun discharges on the set previous to this accident. And it was, according to some crew members, rife with red flags. Let's talk a little bit about Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. She was the armorer. The armorer is the person on set tasked with overseeing weapons and ammunition. This is the person, if you're going to have a movie set with any kind of weaponry, this is a person, a professional who should be trained in this, especially in all the safety concerns with having weapons on set. According to the crew, Gutierrez-Reed didn't keep the weapons safe or locked up while filming. She was a 25-year-old daughter of an expert Hollywood armorer named Thel Reed. Rust producers apparently struggled to recruit experienced crew members, and in fact, several prop masters turned down the job before they eventually landed on Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. Part of the chaos on set was Baldwin's own conduct. This is according to prosecutors. Apparently, at one point, he fired a blank round at the crew. He used the gun as a pointer. There was famously footage that came out in the trial of Hannah Gutierrez-Reed where he's using the gun to give directions and handling it in what can only be described as a cavalier manner. He fired the gun apparently once after it was announced to cut and the scene was stopped. According to prosecutors, he was engaging in horseplay with the gun. He was inattentive during firearms training, apparently texting and FaceTiming family members, and he had an erratic and aggressive behavior on set. Before the shooting, in fact, a half dozen crew workers walked off the set protesting working conditions. Apparently, they were upset with the long working hours and the long commutes and the lack of following strict safety protocols. Regulators say, who went on to investigate afterwards, that there were 2 prior accidental discharges of weapons on set, but no disciplinary or corrective action was taken. And in fact, a search warrant recovered over 600 items of evidence, including 500 rounds of ammunition, which were a mix of blanks, dummy rounds, and suspected live rounds. Number 3, the tortured history of the case. First of all, this was an incredibly long investigation. I've been involved in investigations from the very beginning, from when the incident, the shooting, the murder takes place, and even in very complex murder trials, an investigation may take weeks, perhaps months, on the far end, 6 months. Sometimes you have a delay if you're waiting on DNA, but for an investigation like this to take as long as it did, upwards and over a year. First, in December of 2021, Baldwin infamously does an interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos. During that interview, he says he had no idea how a live round ended up on set.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them. Never. That was the training that I had. You don't point a gun at me and pull the trigger.
His words, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger. And this would be criticized greatly by many in the legal community, including myself. How is he out there giving statements in what is an ongoing criminal and civil investigation where his words could definitely and will likely be used against him? Moving on to October of 2022, there was a settlement with the Hutchins family on the civil side of things. And during that settlement, it was decided that filming would continue in Montana with Matthew Hutchins, who was Helena's husband, to take over as executive producer. Again, 1 year after the shooting. Santa Fe County Sheriff confirms that their report has been turned over to the Judicial District Attorney, Mary Carmack Altwies. A year later, this is just in the hands of the Sheriff's Department at this point. Now they're just handing it over to the DA's office, who may take a look at it themselves and decide that they want other things done. In November of 2022, the Sheriff's Office releases their 550-page report. First, let's talk about how long of a report that is, involving what arguably is a very straightforward incident. A gun was pulled, one shot was fired, it went through her body and struck another person. It's tragic, it's awful, there's a lot of complexity which may have led up to it, but the incident itself is fairly straightforward. There's no dispute as to who was holding the gun. There's no dispute as to how she died. It's just a matter of investigating. Now, I guess a lot of that could be attributed to interviewing everyone on set and making sure they got all their I's dotted, T's crossed when it comes to bringing criminal charges and establishing that there was liability and criminal liability on set, but still an inordinate amount of time and a very lengthy report. In January of 2023, charges are announced against Baldwin and Gutierrez-Reed. They are bringing involuntary manslaughter charges. At this point, Hall, the assistant director, had already pled no contest to negligent use of a firearm. He was given a suspended sentence and 6 months probation. And then the prosecution does something which begins a theme for the prosecution. They do a press conference, and they start this media campaign, I think is the only way to describe it. And they talk during several interviews that are given at the time the charges are brought about how Baldwin had his finger on the trigger. And an announcement is made by the DA that, quote, "On my watch, no one is above the law and everyone deserves justice." I worked as a prosecutor for 10 years. I continue to have friends who are prosecutors. This is the world that I live and work in. And I will tell you, in my view, the conduct of the DA's office at this time, and it didn't stop there, but at this time was distasteful to me. Let defense attorneys, and I am a defense attorney, so I'm going to speak freely about this. Let defense attorneys go and speak in front of the cameras and microphones. Let them make the statements. Let them be bold. Let them do their PR campaign. But a prosecutor's office should maintain decorum, because this isn't about winning or losing. This is about representing the people of your state. You have a high responsibility. And to go on this media campaign, I just can't think of another way to describe it. It was like they were promoting a film themselves. And the statements that they made, while not ethically problematic, they left a bad taste in my mouth. Why are we talking about this now? Let the talking be done in court. In February 2023, Baldwin's team filed a motion to disqualify special counsel Andrea Reeb. This is what happens. The prosecutor's office there in New Mexico decides that this is far too big of a case for them to handle locally, and they bring in a special counsel, this woman, Andrea Reeb. Now, soon thereafter that, however, Baldwin's team, and they received some criticism about this, but I applaud their efforts. Anything you do in defense of your client, short of something illegal or unethical, I applaud. Go for it. They argued that due to her role as a member of the New Mexico House of Representatives, which she was, that she arguably was working simultaneously for two different branches of government, and that violated the state constitution. Their argument being that she was part of the executive branch as a prosecutor and part of the legislative branch as being a member of the House of Representatives in New Mexico. Not a bad argument. The prosecution then, in this kind of continuing effort to make sure that they have their statements in the public realm as well, They say that this is just a tactic to, quote, distract from the fact that Helena Hutchins died because of gross negligence and reckless disregard for safety on the Rust film set. Again, do your talking in court. Why are we getting into these arguments outside of court? But it doesn't stop there. In February of 2023, Baldwin challenges the 5-year gun enhancement that was attached to all of this. The 5-year gun enhancement, by the way, is where the real teeth in these charges were. It's a 5-year enhancement, meaning 5 years in prison, also meaning not discretionary by the judge. Mandatory sentencing of 5 years based upon this gun enhancement. However, one small problem, the incident occurred in October of 2021. The law was not in effect until May of 2022. How could you miss this? The prosecutors committed a basic legal error, said Baldwin's team, by charging Mr. Baldwin under a version of the firearm enhancement statute that did not exist on the date of the accident. This, to me, is unforgivable. Are you kidding me? You're not such a small prosecuting office that you don't have a gaggle of law clerks who can take a look at what you're charging and make sure that all the laws are applicable. Unforgivable. However, the DA's office once again labeled this as a tactic by the defense. Quote, the DA's office focus will always remain on ensuring that justice is served and that everyone, even celebrities with fancy attorneys, is held accountable under the law. They made it personal. They were unprofessional. They're attacking the fancy attorneys for pointing out the very obvious mistake they made in charging this case. Laughable. Give me a break. 10 days later, the gun enhancement is dropped. 5 years off of the table, just like that. Their statement, in order to avoid further litigious distractions, come on, by Mr. Baldwin and his attorneys, the district attorney and the special prosecutor have removed the firearm enhancement to the involuntary manslaughter charges and the death of Helena Hutchins on the Rust film set. You kidding me? To avoid further litigious distractions? You mean errors that you made on your own, unforced errors. They went on to say that the prosecution's priority is in securing justice, not securing, get this, billable hours for big city attorneys. Childish, unforgivable, and just really set a tone for what they've already done and what's going to follow as we continue to explore this case. And again, I'll say this. The defense should never apologize for doing their job. And here, this wasn't the efforts of some fancy, high billable hour, big city Hollywood attorneys. They simply looked up the law, realized when it was passed. Any law school student could do that with a Google account. 1 month later, March 2023, special prosecutor then steps down. This is days before the judge was set to decide that issue we talked about previously. Again, she made a statement saying that she would not allow questions about my serving as a legislator and prosecutor to cloud the real issue at hand. Think about this already. How many missteps and backing off and change in pursuit of this case has taken place? That same month, doesn't stop there. That same month, DA Carmack Altwies also steps down to appoint a new special prosecutor, Carrie Morrissey and Jason Lewis. Attorneys, and the reason for this was that attorneys for Gutierrez-Reed this time, not the big city Hollywood billing attorneys, but attorneys for Gutierrez-Reed had challenged the DA's ability to appoint a special prosecutor while she continued to prosecute the case herself. Not a bad point. You're appointing a special prosecutor, meaning you should take a step back. Instead, she wanted to still be a part of the prosecution team while appointing the special prosecutor. The judge agreed with this sound logic. We are now in the realm of amateur hour here. And by the way, I'm being very critical of the prosecution in this case because they have a very serious job to do. Someone lost their life. This poor, innocent woman Helena Hutchins lost her life, and you should take all of this seriously. A month after that, April 2023, charges against Baldwin are dropped entirely. At the time, the statement made by the special prosecutors was that this was so that they could conduct further investigation. After a year, after a 500-plus page investigation was done, in October of 2023, 2 years after the incident, special prosecutors now announce they are convening a grand jury. And I'll tell you this right now. This is an empty gesture to save face. This is an empty gesture towards transparency and objectivity. They don't need a grand jury to bring an indictment of a charge here. They already had their investigation done. That is the job of a prosecutor's office, is to bring charges. They already did bring charges, but now all of a sudden they're involving the grand jury. I think it was to give them cover. I think it was to give them an excuse for why they had the missteps that they did to begin with, then had to dismiss it against them, and they're now bringing charges again. They needed some sort of cover or excuse for why they were going to again charge this man for this shooting, and a grand jury seemed like a very convenient way to do that. There's a long-standing joke in the criminal justice world that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. And while not entirely true, the sentiment is not lost that if an indictment is really something that's needed, a prosecutor can present things in the right way to make sure that they are almost ensured of an indictment. In January of 2024, Baldwin is then indicted, to the shock of no one, for 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter. A short time later, March of 2024, Gutierrez-Reed is found guilty of involuntary manslaughter at her own trial. She is sentenced to 18 months in prison, which brings us now to July of 2024, where Baldwin is set to begin trial. Point number 4, the gun. This is a short point, but perhaps the most important point in this entire case, at least according to the prosecution. This whole case seems to boil down to, in their view, and maybe there's some sound logic behind that, but in their view as to whether or not he pulled the trigger. It is, from the prosecution's perspective, the only thing that seems to really matter here. During the Gutierrez-Reed trial, an FBI investigator testified that the gun was fully functional with safety features at the time that it was fired. But here's where things began to have some problems. They wanted to eliminate the argument that Baldwin was likely going to make that this gun somehow fired without him pulling the trigger. And that was largely based upon, I think, the statements that he made to the press beforehand. So in an effort to prove that this gun could not be fired in any other way other than the trigger being pulled, they asked the investigator to take whatever steps were necessary to try to get that gun to fire without the trigger being pulled. And the expert had to strike the fully cocked gun with a mallet and break it in order for it to fire without depressing the trigger. But in doing so, they broke the weapon. And what problems does that present for them? Well, the defense has brought motions. They have not been successful, but they're going to argue this in court, that they couldn't fully test the gun themselves. All of the evidence has to be available to the defense, and the prosecution is seen as being stewards, custodians of that evidence. And that's why they will oftentimes preserve material that has fingerprints or DNA on it so that the defense can independently test it. In a case like this, you only have one item, and you destroyed that item in its testing, and now the defense is not able to bring in their own expert to take a look at that weapon and come to their own conclusions. Now, the judge in this case, and I think rightfully so, said, well, you can cross-examine on all of that. The testing was done by the FBI and likely came to the conclusion that a defense expert was probably not going to come to a satisfactory opinion otherwise. But still, it creates a problem for the prosecution. And even recently, a forensic science services in Arizona came to the conclusion that the trigger had to be pulled or depressed sufficiently to release the fully cocked or retracted hammer of the evidence revolver. So that's really, I think, what this case is coming down to. You've got the prosecution saying there's no way this gun could have gone off without the trigger being pulled. You've got Baldwin saying, I never pulled the trigger. You've got all of the surrounding circumstances of the chaos on set. But the prosecution, and maybe rightfully so, has said to themselves, well, despite his behavior, despite the safety measures, despite Hannah Gutierrez-Reed and her involvement and Hall and his involvement, if he didn't pull that trigger, then we don't feel we should charge him. But we know that he had to have pulled that trigger, therefore we're going to charge him. Which brings us to our last and final point, the charges. Let's get into that. First, there's two theories of involuntary manslaughter here, and they're being charged in what's called the alternative, which is not uncommon. Many times you will see that prosecutors will bring one charge, but there might be different arguments as to how those elements of that charge are satisfied, as we're seeing here. In this case, manslaughter is charged separately in 2 counts, but it's the same act that we're dealing with death caused in the commission of a negligent use of a firearm. Okay, and what that means is that a death was caused while some other type of crime was being committed. In the commission of negligent use of a firearm, you killed a person. And it's almost like this bootstrapping or piggybacking theory that had a death occurred while the defendant was also committing some other criminal act, you can substitute the intent for that criminal act for the intent required for the involuntary manslaughter. So he was criminally negligent in his use of a firearm, and that criminal negligence or intent can be used to satisfy the elements of intent for involuntary manslaughter because someone in fact lost their life. The second theory is that the death was caused by an act committed with total disregard or indifference for the safety of others, and that act was such that an ordinary person would anticipate that death might occur under the circumstances. Slightly different, but nuanced. In this theory, they're arguing that he was acting in his overall behavior was demonstrating total disregard or indifference to the safety of others. That we're not going to pin this to one criminal act, but we're just going to say his general cavalier disregard and indifference towards the safety of others in such a way that it caused this person's death. But here's the crucial part of all of that. The law requires that that person act in such a way that, quote, an ordinary person would anticipate that death might occur under the circumstances. And the prosecution is saying that he should have anticipated, Alec Baldwin should have anticipated that death might occur from the cavalier way in which he was handling that weapon. The defense, if they know what they're doing, and I think that they do, I hope that they do, I think is going to make the argument of how would an actor in those circumstances anticipate that death might occur by being handed a gun on a movie set and being told that it's a cold gun. Put aside even this idea of the gun being declared cold. It's an actor on a movie set being handed a prop gun. You're telling me that under those circumstances, an ordinary person, an ordinary actor would anticipate that death might occur simply by pulling that trigger? I'm sorry, I don't buy it. If I'm his defense team, I am going back to every movie he has filmed over his long career. And how many times was a gun involved in those filmings? And how many times was he individually handed a gun on set? Hundreds? Perhaps thousands? And did he ever anticipate that it would lead to someone's death by him handling that gun? Now, that's not to say that bad behavior shouldn't be acknowledged, or him treating the gun as if it's completely harmless and nothing to be even respected. But you're telling me he should anticipate in rehearsing a scene for a movie being directed apparently to actually point the gun at the camera where there's people around. A gun he's told is cold, a gun that's been handed to him, if not directly, indirectly by the armorer, whose whole job is to render that gun safe. He's supposed to anticipate that that might lead to someone's death. Now, that all being said, the prosecution now says that they have new video evidence showing Baldwin being reckless and engaging in horseplay with the firearms. They're also apparently saying that Baldwin asked for the biggest gun available. Not quite sure how that's going to move the needle. Then finally, we get down to the question of, will Hannah Gutierrez Reed testify? And there's been a lot of discussion about this recently in the news because apparently the prosecution want to offer her immunity. And at first, it may seem as though it's the prosecution trying to get Gutierrez Reed to testify. Gutierrez Reed has a Fifth Amendment right not to testify because there's still an pending appeal in her case. So she could just say, I don't have anything to say here and I can't be compelled to. But if she's granted immunity, there's an argument she can be compelled because she no longer then would have a Fifth Amendment concern. However, I think this is more of a game of 3D chess being played by the defense. The defense wanted to use the fact that she had a Fifth Amendment right to call her what's called an unavailable witness. In other words, the defense cannot call this witness to the stand to testify because that witness will declare a Fifth Amendment right not to testify. That witness should then therefore be declared unavailable. And what's the importance of that? Well, if you have an unavailable witness, you're allowed to use prior statements of that witness. And Hannah Gutierrez Reed gave interviews. And in those interviews, she apparently gave statements that are far more favorable to Baldwin in this case. And they thought they saw an excellent opportunity to put her on the stand as an unavailable witness, or just call her and have her declared unavailable, and then have the opportunity to play those statements without cross-examination of her explaining those statements in front of the jury. Now, a judge recently decided that, in fact, they will not allow for immunity to be placed upon Gutierrez Reed, meaning she still maintains this Fifth Amendment right. So this whole gambit by the defense could work out. The prosecution says that they still might call her as a witness. They still believe that perhaps she will be cooperative, waive her Fifth Amendment right, and be subject to cross-examination. We shall see. I think the DA is hinging their hopes on jail calls where Gutierrez Reed apparently made statements along the lines that she wants to see Baldwin in jail. And lastly, will Baldwin testify himself? Well, if he's smart, I think no. And if his defense attorneys have anything to say about it, I think no. And usually a defendant really has no good reason to testify. One exception to that is when they have to explain statements that they made themselves before. And here we know that Baldwin made a lot of statements before. And so it might be one of those situations where he has to explain himself to the jurors, to explain those statements if they are played for the jury. And I think they will, with him saying that he never pulled that trigger and the prosecution being able to prove that not only is that not true, but then he's also a liar. He might feel that he's compelled to get on the stand to explain himself. Last thing is, it's hard to tell a person who's made their entire career on standing in front of microphones and cameras and explaining themselves and winning over audiences that they shouldn't do that now in the most crucial time in their life. We'll see if ego plays a role in any of this. At the end of the day, though, triggers being pulled, triggers not being pulled, them being pulled accidentally or not, the chaos on the set. To me, what this boils down to is, how did live ammunition ever end up on that set to begin with? We never would have had this problem, and no one would have ever suspected this may be a problem. How does live ammunition end up anywhere near that set and in that weapon? This is a tragedy. It's a sad case that should never be lost. A wonderful human lost their life, Helena Hutchins. And I think all of that would have prevented had that ammunition never been on set. And that reason is probably something I would be much more concerned with rather than the last person to be handed the gun, the actor who feels like he's doing the same thing with a weapon he's always done in his entire career. But that is us for now. Thank you again for joining me for this very special episode of 5 Things by Courtroom Confidential. I hope that you have a great week. Please make sure to always tune in on Fridays when we have a brand new episode of Courtroom Confidential. This has been fun to really get in deep into this case. The trial is beginning soon. We will have more coverage on it. Thank you again, and take care.